Donald Trump has upended the world order, and it's not clear what will take its place. In the inaugural Vantage Point essay from Australia Institute Press, Dr. Emma Shortis examines the future of our alliance with the United States, which all too often makes us less safe and not more. You can order your copy of After America, Australia and the New World Order now, or you can become a foundation subscriber to Vantage Point and save 25% on an annual subscription. Find it at australiainstitute.org.au/store or via the link in the show notes.
After America is made on the lands of the Kure-Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Angus Blackman, and this is After America. Donald Trump keeps telling us who he is. This week, Trump attempted another ritual humiliation in the Oval Office. He met with the South African president and, as much of the media coverage has framed it, ambushed him with printouts and a slideshow of white supremacist conspiracies about post-apartheid South Africa.
There were tense scenes in the Oval Office between US President Donald Trump and his guest, South Africa's leader Cyril Ramaphosa.
One of the images is actually from Reuters video of a mass burial in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It does not depict dead white farmers in South Africa.
We know that that was not true and that the video wasn't showing that, so I wonder, why did the president choose to show that? True, you mean? It's not true. The video was showing a burial site. It is unsubstantiated that that's the case.
No, it is true that video showed the crosses.
But this kind of politics isn't really new. Trump trades on the idea that white Americans are having their power taken away by non-white people. By ambushing the black South African president, as his administration welcomes white South African refugees, he's sending a clear message. The white guys are in charge. This same power game is what's driving the Trump administration's war on Harvard University. High-profile Democrats, meanwhile, are focused on the important stuff: Gold Coast real estate and relitigating the last election. To take us through some of these latest developments and what they mean for Australia, I'm joined by Dr. Emma Shortis, the Australia Institute's Director of International and Security Affairs. G'day, Emma.
Hey, Angus.
How you doing?
I'm pretty good. Everything is too much as usual, but pretty good. What about you?
Yeah, living the dream. Firstly, and I think most importantly, Kamala Harris over the weekend spoke at a real estate conference on the Gold Coast, which is possibly the weirdest combination of words ever said. Why did she at least get a fishbowl at Melba's? Does Melba's still exist? I've got so many questions.
Well, I mean, I think you know more about the Gold Coast than I do, so I'll leave that question to you.
Yeah,
it is super weird. Hey, like a lot of weird things have happened, but you know, reading the headline in The Guardian, Harris takes swipe at Musk and warns world to remember the 1930s at Gold Coast real estate conference is quite the combination of words. I will say it's not at all weird or unusual for former presidents or vice presidents or even candidates to go on the speaking circuit, especially in the US. It's incredibly lucrative. Listeners might remember that when Hillary Clinton was running for the candidacy, there were a lot of questions about, you know, how much money she'd earned from speaking tours and who had been paying her and whether that would affect how people thought about her. I actually saw Michelle Obama interviewed by Roxanne Gay at a really intense corporate leadership conference in Boston when I was in the States that, you know, had like flashing purple lights and screaming fans. So it isn't weird in a kind of celebrity culture of American politics. It is weird that it was on the Gold Coast, that was her first one.
So much judgment in your voice.
Oh, sorry. So I don't know. I mean, I can only assume that, you know, maybe it was quite lucrative or maybe just the invitation came at the right time and she wanted to get as far away from the United States as possible for a little while. But yeah, it is a strange thing for the former vice president to be being interviewed by a high-profile real estate figure in Australia about remembering the 1930s. That's weird.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, Australian leaders go on something of a speaking circuit too, right? There was, I think, Morrison went on tour in the US and whatever. But it kind of speaks to the differences in our political cultures, right? That's just normal for US politicians, whereas we kind of scoff at the whole idea of it. It seems ridiculous.
Yeah, well, you and I have been doing a lot of scoffing about this, rightly, I think. But it does. I think it absolutely does, Angus, speak to the big differences between our political cultures that we've spoken about before, that politicians in the US become celebrities or aspire to become celebrities, to go on Oprah Winfrey's show and things like that in a way that Australian politicians generally don't, because it's viewed, I think, as perhaps inauthentic in Australia and also, a bit cringe. Like, I think it's seen as kind of embarrassing. So, this is a weird one from a number of angles. But as far as I can see, Harris has gotten away with not really getting any coverage of it in the States, partly probably because a lot more is going on.
On a genuinely much more serious note, we saw this week some sad news about former President Joe Biden's health. He has been diagnosed with an aggressive form of prostate cancer, and this has been covered extensively in the US media. Emma, could you just talk us through what's happened and what you've made of the coverage?
Yeah, sure. So this announcement from the Biden team about his health, which I think confirmed a lot of already existing fears or suspicions about what might have happened if he had won that second term. This coincided with the release of a new book about what is described as basically the cover-up of Biden's declining health and his refusal to withdraw from the race earlier. It's called Original Sin: President Biden's Decline, Its Cover-Up, and His Disastrous Choice to Run Again. And it's written by some CNN journos. So it's been getting heaps and heaps of coverage, of course. This is exactly the kind of thing journalists and mainstream media love, this kind of dissection of Biden's decision-making and what they describe as a cover-up. So CNN has been kind of consumed by it. I'm sort of in two minds about it because, of course, there needs to be an extended discussion and reflection on Biden's decision to run for a second term and the implications of that, and whether him dropping out earlier, doing an LBJ and not deciding to run might have yielded a better result. But that's not really what the conversation is about. So much of this strikes me as just journalists and senior Democratic insiders talking to each other rather than actually talking about why this matters and what matters to the American people. The media coverage has been kind of rife with speculation about how this will impact Democrats going forward, whether it would have an impact on the 2028 race for the Democratic nominee, just kind of getting into the realms of the absolutely ridiculous. And I think letting Democrats off the hook because it's not dealing with that bigger issue of who now is going to take the Democrats forward and where they are going to go, how they're going to provide a credible opposition to Trump, which they're just not doing. And looking backwards to Biden, I think is really not helping in that process.
Mr. President, decide what will it take for you to be convinced that there's no white genocide in South Africa?
Excuse me, turn the lights down. Turn the lights down and just put this on. It's right behind you. Now this is very bad. These are burial sites right here. Burial sites. Over 1,000 of white farmers. And it's a terrible sight. I've never seen anything like it.
So moving now from the Democrats to the administration. Last week, Trump pulled off another Oval Office special. He ambushed the South African president in front of the press in scenes pretty reminiscent of the meeting with Zelensky a month or two back. Wow, is that a month or two? It feels like forever.
Eternity.
Yeah. And in doing so, he was peddling false claims about white genocide in South Africa. What is he doing?
So this, I think, was a really clear example of Trump being Trump. There's this idea, I think, that still permeates some of the coverage that he engages in this kind of extreme racism or white supremacy as a political tactic, that this is about him peddling to the base or working to reinforce his power with the base. But what this shows, I think, is that Trump is all in with this kind of extreme white supremacist ideology. He is the classic crazy uncle who's gone down the Facebook rabbit hole, who's like literally printing out memes and tweets and things about this mythical white genocide that's happening in South Africa, which is a staple of white supremacist narratives across international networks. It's one that has reared its ugly head in Australia as well, where we've had former opposition leader Peter Dutton talking about similar things and suggesting that Australia needs to accept more Afrikaner quote-unquote refugees.
We have a huge South African expat community within Australia. They work hard, they integrate well into Australian society, they contribute and make us a better country, and they're the sorts of migrants that we want to bring into our country.
It looks like Peter Dutton wants to bring back the White Australia policy. It seems that Peter Dutton thinks that if you are a white South African farmer, you can make a contribution to Australia. But if you're somebody from a non-white background, that somehow you're here to cheat the system.
So it's not at all surprising that this has come up in the Trump administration. It's something that a lot of them talk about quite often. Elon Musk also talks about it quite often. It's no coincidence that Musk and many of the powerful figures in American politics are South African. And so, this narrative gets more exposure than I think it otherwise would.
And 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a story about how Grok, Twitter's AI bot, started pumping out some of these claims as well about white genocide unprompted.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big coincidence, no?
Yeah. Very interesting coincidence. And I think it is another example of how the internet and social media and AI are awash with these kind of narratives and exposes, how, I suppose, power is wielded within those structures, that AI is not apolitical, that it is clearly influenced by the people who build it. Twitter is the same, where, those mediums reflect the kind of power structures that the people who run them are interested in building. So we see this feedback loop then between those systems, between those powerful figures and the White House, the most powerful office in the world.
And there was all this talk at Trump's inauguration about the placement of kind of the big boss tech bros at the front of the crowd, and about Trump's relationship with like moneyed interests in the US government. We've obviously talked a lot about Elon Musk. This would seem to be some practical evidence of, I suppose, of potentially what Trump's trying to do, right? Like I'm not saying that Elon Musk is feeding white genocide things into the machine and it's spitting out whatever, but like if you're looking to control information and put yourself in a really strong position of power, then he's done it, right? It's worked.
Yeah, he's done it really effectively. And it's a classic case of, Trump, the president, asserting these absolute lies about what's happening in South Africa, and then there having to be a reaction when it's already, it's already out there. People are already believing this because Trump is talking about it. And he, at the same time, I think, alongside that, with those powerful figures that you mentioned, and with the United States welcoming, again, quote unquote, refugees, white refugees from South Africa, they are sending a signal about who is in charge, about who has power. The United States welcoming Afrikaner refugees, expediting the screening process for them if they're engaging in it at all, while they're also treating non-white immigrants with such brazen cruelty, is such a clear message about who gets to be American and who is in charge. And again, that's not Trump just engaging in kind of political games. That is a genuine and really dangerous ideology.
Yeah, and I think about what Richard Dennis, the Australia Institute executive director, said on the show a few weeks ago, that people often on the left get consumed by the outrage that this is not evidence-based policy, this is not good governance, whatever. Trump doesn't give a shit. Like he's not trying to solve the problem, he's trying to create the problem, right? This is him creating a problem. It dominates the media cycle. It dominates podcasts.
Yep.
And he gets to go on his merry way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I think we're guilty of this, that, we do things like point out the hypocrisy of the Trump administration in doing things like that. As I was just talking about the way that the administration is dealing with immigration and the contrast between the way it treats, non-white immigrants compared to Afrikaner refugees, some of whom, have a history of posting abhorrent anti-Semitic things on their own social media posts, which the administration has explicitly used to exclude people or to deport people from the United States. So there's this appalling hypocrisy going on. But again, Trump doesn't care about that. None of them care about that. They're engaged in an exercise of raw power and demonstrating very clearly to people that, white people are back in charge. And this is the ideological drive of that administration, which is effectively staffed with segregationists, with people who want to take the United States back to a kind of mythical pre-civil rights movement era where white men had all the power.
The Trump administration has just revoked Harvard University's ability to enroll any international students.
A federal judge has blocked the Trump administration from taking action.
And then overnight, we're hearing from Trump again as he demands more information about the international students who attend.
The university president writing a letter condemning their actions, saying in part, quote, "It imperils the future of thousands of students and scholars across Harvard and serves as a warning to countless others who have come to America to pursue their education."
Why would you not want the best and brightest from around the world to come
I do.
to Harvard?
I do, but a lot of the people need remedial math.
On the subject of anti-Semitism, that's the justification that's being used in the administration's fight with Harvard. That fight included a Twitter beef with pro wrestling magnate turned US education secretary, another funny combination of words, and the Harvard president. Why is Trump so obsessed with Harvard?
I think there's a couple of things going on here. One personal and one more ideological. I think Trump has always wanted desperately to be accepted into the inner circles of American elite power in New York and Washington, and that has included a desire to be included in those Ivy League elite universities. And so he's always been fueled by resentment that he was never quite accepted into those powerful circles. It's like he always is desperate for the New York Times to adore him. It's very much an ego thing. And that is intersecting with a broader ideological hatred, really, for institutions like Harvard from the right, partly because, again, they're not all powerful in those institutions. They are challenged intellectually by those institutions. And they increasingly see Harvard in particular as attempting to undermine their own power, attempting to attack the Trump administration and the kind of hold on power that white men have that we were just talking about, through some of its research, for example, into racism, through its embrace of diversity, equity and inclusion measures and effectively kind of affirmative action measures in its student intake. So all of these things are colliding and are focusing on Harvard University in particular because Harvard is fighting back. Some of the other universities that the Trump administration has gone after, including institutions like Columbia, have been less willing to engage in a fight with the Trump administration. But Harvard, because of its leadership and because of its extended alumni network as well, has very much been pushing back on Trump administration attacks on the courts and democracy and on its treatment of international students in particular. And it has really escalated this week, partly as a result of that letter, but then also as a result of the Secretary for Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, effectively rescinding Harvard's ability to enroll international students. So they've effectively said that the 7,000 international students at Harvard can no longer be there, and this includes 1,600 Australian students. So this has a direct impact on Australia as well. So that sent those students and Harvard into limbo. That measure has since been challenged in the courts, and there's been a 2-week pause put on that. But of course, that doesn't offer any certainty to those students or to Harvard. And we know, and we've spoken about before, how the Trump administration is approaching some of those court orders and the rule of law generally in the United States.
Yeah. And Emma, I know you've studied in the US. If you're one of those students, like, the uncertainty must be just overwhelming. Like, what sort of impact would this have on, the 1,600 Australians you mentioned and really their views on the United States?
Yeah, I think it's such a good question, because what gets missed in a lot of what the Trump administration is doing, not just at Harvard, but in cancelling all of these kinds of programs, in cancelling USAID, for example, is the complete betrayal and the cruelty that comes with that betrayal. I think students like me, go to the United States, to those institutions, trusting that you'll be looked after, that those institutions will hold to what they've promised you, which is a place in a classroom, and in some cases, accommodation or health insurance, for example. To have that taken away without warning, like literally in the space of an hour, would be terrifying. And, when I was there, when I was at Yale University, I had my 2-year-old with me. To have that kind of security taken away from you, to have total uncertainty about the future is really, really frightening. And for the Trump administration to keep doing that, to keep breaking those contracts, I think is a total betrayal of trust, a deliberate one, of course, but one that will be incredibly difficult for those institutions to recover from, in the aftermath of Trump or whatever comes next. Rebuilding those relationships is going to take an incredible amount of work.
Yeah. And I guess these are extremely wealthy institutions. They'll probably be fine themselves. But I know we talk about in the Australian higher education debate, if people decide to not come one year, say this problem is restricted just to the Trump administration. That might not be true, but say it's just the next 3 years or whatever. Like, for those institutions, they don't just create a 1-year problem. They're bringing on students for 2, 3, 4 years. And so it has flow-on effects for, potentially nearly a decade in terms of how people are perceiving the United States.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point, because what I didn't say then is that a lot of the coverage about this Harvard issue has noted the effect in particular on Chinese international students, because part of the justification for this was anti-Semitism, as you mentioned, but also they were effectively arguing, the Trump administration was effectively arguing that Harvard had let in agents of the Chinese Communist Party. And so Chinese international students have been targeted in particular. And there's lots of coverage of individuals, packing their bags and being terrified that ICE agents are going to be knocking on their doors and taking them away, which of course is an entirely rational fear.
Because ICE agents are putting people in vans and taking them off.
Exactly. Literally doing that to international students. So that is a very real fear. And, we know from experience in Australia that governments react appropriately to that and will start, not recommending that their nationals go to the United States to study, despite the fact that these are some of the best universities in the world. And the flow-on effects of that are significant because, of course, exactly as you were suggesting, Angus, those students who are at Harvard now are going to tell all their friends, don't come here. And those people will tell their friends, don't come here. And they will tell younger students, don't come here. And so that, of course, that has immediate implications for Harvard, for income streams, but it also has much broader implications for the role of the United States in the world and bigger relationships between countries. We consistently underestimate how important those relationships between actual people, like between actual human beings that are developed through these exchange programs, have on international relations. Like, that's what international relations and diplomacy actually is. And that's been recognized by these institutions for decades. Like, the program that I did at Yale University was set up during the Cold War in an attempt to deepen genuine relations between the United States and Russia so that people understood each other better and were less likely to escalate their conflict into an apocalyptic nuclear war. Like, it sounds dramatic, but those kinds of relationships really do matter to how people who will end up in powerful positions see each other, and undermining that is potentially catastrophic. And of course, the Trump administration doesn't care about that. That's the point. But I think it's really important that we think about this as a genuine issue of international relations and human relationships, that like this is what diplomacy is, at least partly.
Yeah. As we draw today's episode to a close, I wanted to bring it back to Australia.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about that those interpersonal relationships are what international relations is, really. Much as, you know, very serious international relations types want to push that it's all about, you know, government to government stuff and bombs and security arrangements and all of this stuff. The Albanese government's been re-elected with an enormous majority in the lower house, at least. How likely do you think this is that they're going to recognize, that the new government's going to recognise this as an opportunity and really put Australia's best foot forward when it comes to, you know, students for starters, and encouraging international students to come here?
Yeah, I think this is a huge opportunity. And I mean, it has to be said that Australia's ambassador to the US, Kevin Rudd, is working really hard to support the students who are directly affected by this, and has acknowledged, you know, the uncertainty and the fear that it creates. And I think in that is the possibility of the recognition of the opportunity that the government now has, you know, given, as exactly as you've said, that it has the space to do this, doesn't have to ask the Liberals for permission to do things, that it can really step up and support, I mean, of course, support Australians who are at these institutions really vocally, and talk about our relationship and how our nationals will be treated by, you know, our apparent best friend in the world. But I think there's also a bigger opportunity here for the Australian government to support Australian higher education institutions, many of whom, like, you know, the one I did, have these agreements and networks in place already with American institutions, to really support those networks, to support those research networks, to support American researchers to come here and continue to do their best work, to build those relationships, and to really lean into the shared values that we hear all about all the time. And I think that can be really practical things. You know, it can be doing things like bringing experts in American democracy from those institutions out to Australia to talk about Australian democratic institutions, for example, and what we can learn from each other. I think it's so important to continue to foster and deepen those relationships and recognize that, exactly as you were saying, you know, our relationship with the United States is so much bigger than government to government relations, than just that security relationship, and that we can actually, if we choose to, you know, bring out the best in each other and support higher education institutions and research relationships and the international rule of law, not just by doing that kind of traditional diplomacy. And because of Trump, because of what the Trump administration is doing, we do require, I think, this rethink of what the relationship is, what it can achieve, and how we manage it. And I think the seeds of that are there. I think the openness to that is there, in the government and in the community. Again, it's just, as we've discussed multiple times, you know, whether the Australian government is brave enough to actively make that choice.
Yeah, and as you say, rhetorically at least, the Prime Minister has talked about progressive patriotism, and that would seem to, I guess, signal in that direction. I mean, obviously they've only been re-elected for a couple of weeks, but if that's going to have any meaningful impact beyond the words themselves, that needs to be backed up with action, right?
It does. And I think in the case of these students in particular, we can be confident that there will be that kind of action. And I think we can also be confident that the Australian government will itself be more confident in standing up for those kinds of values. But I suppose my concern is that the possibility that we'll have still this kind of two-track approach to foreign policy is very real. So where you have some movement in those areas, you know, around support for Australian students, even around the Australian government being more vocal on issues like Israel and Gaza, for example, we can see that happening. We can see space opening up. But at the same time, there's not a lot of movement on the core of the relationship, that, you know, capital S security relationship that we've talked about, where there still appears to be this unwillingness to connect what the Trump administration is doing to the AUKUS submarine deal, for example, and the capital A alliance. Until there's a willingness, I think, to connect those two things, we will see largely the same processes from Australian foreign policy.
Well, Emma, that's probably all we've got time for. Thanks very much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Angus.
If you want to read more, you can order your copy of our inaugural Vantage Point essay. In the first edition, After America, Australia and the New World Order, Emma explores the future of our alliance with the United States. You can purchase the first edition or become a Foundation subscriber to the Vantage Point series via our website, australiainstitute.org.au/store, or tap the link in the show notes. We'd love to get your thoughts on the show so far. You can send us feedback as well as episode and guest ideas via our email address, podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Monday, the 26th of May, and no doubt a bunch of stuff has changed. And After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation. We'll be back next week. I'm Angus Blackman. Thanks for listening.